The story begins in a world where fear had become an ordinary condition of childhood, so constant that it no longer announced itself with panic but settled quietly into habit. For these children, the war was not an abstract conflict discussed by adults or reported in distant places. It was a daily atmosphere as familiar as cold mornings or empty cupboards, shaping how they moved, where they stood, and when they spoke. Long before they understood nations or armies, they had learned patterns of danger. Certain sounds meant stop. Certain shapes meant hide. Certain colors meant that whatever small sense of normality existed was about to be disrupted. Uniforms were at the center of this understanding. They were not associated with protection or order but with intrusion. Boots on stone, engines slowing near a village, voices barking unfamiliar words. These were signals that preceded loss. Food disappeared. Doors were forced open. Adults grew tense and quiet. Sometimes people did not come back. Over time, the children learned that uniforms erased individuality. It did not matter who wore them or what language they spoke. What mattered was what always followed. Uniforms meant that the rules of ordinary life no longer applied. Hunger was a constant companion, but fear shaped behavior more deeply than hunger ever could. A starving child might risk punishment for a crust of bread, but fear taught restraint. It taught waiting. It taught invisibility. Children learned which alleys offered concealment, which stairwells swallowed sound, which ruined walls could break a line of sight. These were not lessons given in words but absorbed through observation, repetition, and quiet correction from adults who themselves had learned the same way. Survival was communal, but fear was internalized early. Parents tried to shield their children, but war narrowed the space in which protection could operate. Reassurance sounded hollow when contradicted by reality. Promises that things would be fine were made less often, not because adults had lost hope, but because hope spoken aloud felt like an invitation to disappointment. Instead, guidance became practical and stripped of comfort. Stay close. Do not stare. Do not speak unless spoken to. Run if you have to. Hide if you can. These instructions carried no drama, only urgency. The children noticed how adults changed when uniforms appeared. Voices dropped. Postures stiffened. Faces became unreadable. Adults who laughed easily among neighbors became careful and restrained, measuring each word. This transformation taught the children more than any direct warning. Fear was contagious, transmitted through silence and tension rather than screams. Even very young children understood that something essential had been taken from the adults, the confidence that tomorrow would resemble today. As the war dragged on, fear stopped being episodic and became structural. It shaped routines. Windows were covered. Lights were dimmed earlier than necessary. Meals, when they happened, were eaten quickly and without conversation. Childhood rituals dissolved quietly. Games became shorter, quieter, and more cautious. Play was no longer an escape but a brief imitation of normality conducted under watchful eyes. Laughter, when it surfaced, was often cut short by a sudden awareness that it might carry too far. The children learned to read danger not only in uniforms but in absence. Silence could be just as threatening as noise. A street too empty meant something had happened or was about to. Shops that did not open meant supplies had failed or orders had been given. Familiar faces missing from their usual places were noted and remembered. Loss became cumulative, stacking quietly in memory. Each absence reinforced the lesson that nothing was stable, nothing guaranteed. Authority, as experienced by these children, was arbitrary and distant. Rules changed without explanation. Punishments arrived without warning. There was no appeal, no negotiation, no sense that fairness had any relevance. This taught the children that power was something to avoid, not engage. Questions were dangerous. Curiosity was risky. Compliance was safest, even when it brought no reward. Over time, this understanding hardened into instinct. In this environment, fear did not always feel like terror. More often, it felt like tension, like a tightness that never fully released. It was present in the way children slept lightly, waking at unfamiliar sounds. It was present in how they ate, saving crumbs without knowing why. It was present in how they watched adults' faces for cues before reacting to anything unexpected. Childhood, stripped of its assumptions, became a period of alertness rather than exploration. Yet even within this landscape, the children retained a sense of order, however fragile. They knew which adults were safe, which neighbors could be trusted, which paths led home fastest. They understood boundaries and routines, even if those routines were built around avoidance. This limited order gave structure to days otherwise defined by uncertainty. It allowed life to continue, though reduced, constrained, and constantly interrupted. The war's moral universe, as the children experienced it, was simple but unforgiving. Those with power inflicted harm. Those without endured it. There were no exceptions visible from their perspective. Kindness, when it appeared, came from within the community and was always cautious, always limited by scarcity. Strangers were dangerous by default. Outsiders brought risk. This was not prejudice but conditioning, reinforced by repeated experience. By the time the war reached its later stages, these lessons were deeply embedded. The children no longer needed reminders to hide when uniforms appeared. Their bodies reacted before thought could intervene. Muscles tightened. Breath slowed. Eyes searched for cover. Fear operated faster than reason, faster than hope. It was efficient, practiced, and effective. In this context, innocence did not vanish in a single moment. It narrowed gradually. The children still felt joy, still noticed beauty, still played when they could, but these experiences were bounded by an awareness that they were temporary. Nothing was allowed to feel permanent. Even happiness was treated with caution, as if lingering too long might attract attention. The landscape itself mirrored this emotional state. Buildings bore marks of damage, repaired unevenly or not at all. Fields were underused or abandoned. Roads carried unfamiliar traffic at irregular hours. The physical environment reinforced the sense that order had been disrupted and might not return. For children, whose understanding of the world depends heavily on stability, this created a background of quiet unease that never fully lifted. This was the world in which the story begins, not at the moment of liberation or encounter, but in the long accumulation of fear that preceded it. A fear so normalized that it no longer surprised, only instructed. A fear that taught children how to disappear, how to endure, and how to expect nothing from those who arrived wearing symbols of authority. When uniforms entered their lives, the children did not wait to see what kind of men wore them. History had already answered that question too many times. It is important to understand this foundation, because without it, what follows cannot be fully grasped. The shock of later events does not come from spectacle or drama, but from contradiction. It comes from the way deeply learned expectations were challenged, not by argument or proclamation, but by action. Before that rupture could occur, fear had to be complete, unquestioned, and justified by experience. Only then could its reversal carry weight. Chapter 1 is not a story of a single incident, but of a condition. It is the slow shaping of perception, the quiet training of instinct, the transformation of childhood into vigilance. It is a world where uniforms meant danger, where survival depended on withdrawal, and where hope learned to stay hidden. This is the emotional ground on which everything else stands, and without it, the moment when fear begins to fracture would have no meaning at all. The arrival of unfamiliar uniforms did not announce itself with ceremony or clarity. There was no single moment when the children understood that something different was happening. Instead, there was a gradual intrusion into the edges of their awareness, the low rumble of vehicles approaching from a direction that had been quiet for weeks, the unusual spacing of footsteps, the absence of the sharp, shouted commands that usually accompanied such movement. These details registered first not as hope, but as uncertainty, which in many ways felt more dangerous than fear itself. Instinct took over before curiosity had time to form. The children did not stop to observe or analyze. Their bodies responded as they had been trained to respond by months and years of repetition. They withdrew. They slipped behind door frames, crouched behind broken walls, pressed themselves into the narrow spaces they had learned offered concealment. The act of hiding was so automatic that it carried no sense of drama. It was simply what one did when uniforms appeared. From these positions, the children watched. They did not yet see individuals, only shapes and movement. The uniforms were different in color and cut, but difference had never mattered before. Power looked the same regardless of variation. Boots were boots. Weapons were weapons. The presence of armed men was enough to activate every warning the past had embedded in them. Whatever followed, they assumed, would require endurance rather than resistance. Adults reacted similarly, but with an added layer of calculation. They recognized that these uniforms were not the ones they had learned to fear most, but recognition did not equal trust. The war had taught them that changes in authority rarely brought relief, only a different form of vulnerability. They urged the children to stay back, to remain unseen, to let the situation reveal itself before taking any risk. Silence settled over the streets, heavy and deliberate. The soldiers moved through the area with a pace that confused those watching. They did not rush, but neither did they linger with the intention of asserting control. Their movements lacked the aggressive certainty the children associated with occupation. There was scanning, not searching. Observation, not interrogation. Still, none of this was enough to override instinct. The absence of immediate violence did not signal safety, it merely delayed the moment when harm might occur. From hiding, the children noticed small anomalies. The soldiers spoke among themselves in low tones rather than shouting. They did not immediately enter homes or seize goods. Their posture was alert but not confrontational. These details accumulated quietly, creating a sense of cognitive dissonance. The children had learned to expect certain patterns, and those patterns were not fully materializing. Yet fear remained dominant. The children did not interpret restraint as kindness. They interpreted it as uncertainty, or worse, strategy. Past experience had taught them that moments of calm often preceded harsher measures. A quiet arrival could mean that orders had not yet been given, or that something more severe was being prepared. Waiting, therefore, felt safer than approaching. Then came the gesture that none of them were prepared for. One of the soldiers stopped near a doorway where several children were partially concealed. Instead of shouting or advancing, he lowered himself, reducing the physical difference between them. He did not reach for his weapon. Instead, he reached into his pack and brought out bread. At first, this action did not register as meaning. It was simply confusing. Food had always been a resource guarded by those in power, distributed conditionally or seized outright. To see it offered freely, without demand or threat, disrupted the internal logic the children relied on to navigate danger. The bread did not look special. It was not abundant, but its presence in that context was extraordinary. The children did not move. Hunger surged, but fear held them in place. Accepting food from a uniformed soldier felt like crossing an invisible boundary, one that could not easily be uncrossed. They watched for signs of deception, for sudden movement, for the tightening of posture that usually preceded punishment. None came. Other soldiers followed the example, producing food, water, small gestures of care that seemed almost tentative. They did not force these offerings on the children. They waited. The waiting itself was unsettling. Power, as the children understood it, did not wait for consent. It took. Minutes passed in a suspended state. The children's calculations were silent but intense. Hunger pressed against caution. Memory warned against trust. Every story they had absorbed about uniforms argued against stepping forward. Yet the bread remained extended, unchanged, as if time itself had slowed around the gesture. Eventually, one child moved. The decision did not come from bravery or belief, but from need. The step forward was small, almost imperceptible, but it altered the emotional balance of the moment. When the bread was placed into the child's hands and nothing else happened, no shouting, no grabbing, no consequence, the atmosphere shifted slightly, though no one yet dared to name it. The children watched the child eat, half expecting interruption. None came. The soldier did not react with satisfaction or authority. He simply observed, as if the act itself required no acknowledgement. This lack of reaction was as important as the offering. It suggested that the gesture was not transactional, not a test or a trap. Slowly, others followed. Each movement forward was cautious, measured, ready to reverse. The children accepted food and retreated again, keeping distance even as their hands held something that contradicted everything they believed about men in uniform. The experience did not feel joyful. It felt unreal, as though it might dissolve if examined too closely. Adults watched with the same guarded intensity. They did not intervene, but neither did they encourage. They understood the stakes differently. For them, this was not only about food, but about the possibility that the moral order imposed by war might not be as absolute as it had seemed. That possibility was both hopeful and dangerous. The encounter did not resolve fear. It complicated it. The children did not suddenly trust the soldiers. They did not forget what uniforms had meant yesterday or the day before. But something had been introduced that did not fit the established pattern. A crack had appeared in the narrative they relied on for survival. As the soldiers moved on, leaving behind neither threat nor demand, the children remained in place long after they were gone. The bread was eaten slowly, deliberately, as if speed might invite correction. The absence of punishment lingered longer than the food itself. It was this absence that unsettled them most. That night, the children struggled to place the experience within their understanding of the world. Fear still dominated, but it no longer felt entirely sufficient as an explanation. The war had taught them that power was cruel by default. What they had witnessed did not negate that lesson, but it challenged its completeness. Chapter 2 is not the moment fear disappears. It is the moment fear encounters contradiction. It is the introduction of uncertainty into a system built on predictability. The children did not yet feel safe, but they had seen something that could not be easily dismissed or forgotten. In a world governed by repetition, this single deviation carried enormous weight. The days that followed did not bring clarity so much as tension of a different kind. Fear was still present, but it no longer moved in a straight line. It circled. It hesitated. It returned to old positions only to be interrupted by memory. The image of bread held out by a uniformed hand refused to disappear, resurfacing at unexpected moments and unsettling the careful emotional order the children had constructed to survive. What had once been simple now demanded explanation, and explanation was something war had taught them to avoid. Hunger made memory vivid. Each time the children felt the familiar ache in their stomachs, they remembered not just the taste of the bread, but the absence of consequence that followed it. This absence was troubling. Punishment was predictable, mercy was not. Predictability had been their protection. The idea that something could be offered freely by someone with power introduced a risk they did not know how to measure. The children replayed the moment internally, searching for hidden signals they might have missed. They examined every detail in retrospect, looking for clues that would restore the old certainty. Was the soldier distracted? Was it a temporary tactic? Had something worse simply been delayed? Their minds, trained by repeated disappointment, resisted the possibility that the gesture had been exactly what it appeared to be. Adults did not offer easy interpretations. Conversations, when they happened, were cautious and fragmented. No one wanted to give the children false hope, but no one could fully dismiss what had occurred either. The war had punished optimism harshly. At the same time, denying the evidence of their own eyes felt dishonest. The result was a silence filled with unspoken questions. When the soldiers returned, the tension sharpened. This time, the children did not scatter as quickly, but neither did they approach. They hovered at a distance, testing their own reactions. Fear urged retreat. Memory urged pause. The conflict between these impulses created a strange stillness, as if the children were waiting for their own instincts to make up their minds. Again, food was offered. Again, no demands followed. The repetition mattered. It suggested intention rather than accident. Still, trust did not grow in a straight line. Each encounter was evaluated independently, weighed against the entire history that preceded it. The children accepted what was given, but they did not relax. They ate, but they watched. They stepped forward, but they stayed ready to step back. What unsettled them most was not kindness itself, but the way it was delivered. There was no performance, no visible attempt to be seen as benevolent. The soldiers did not exaggerate their gestures or seek gratitude. They did not explain themselves. This lack of narrative made interpretation difficult. The children were accustomed to understanding actions through threat or reward. Here, neither applied. As time passed, the children noticed other details that complicated their understanding. The soldiers avoided unnecessary displays of force. They spoke to adults with restraint. They did not take more than they needed. None of these actions erased the reality of war, but they created friction against the dominant story the children had learned. Authority, in this context, was not behaving as expected. This friction produced an emotional strain that was exhausting. It was easier to be afraid than to be uncertain. Fear demanded less thought. It required only obedience and avoidance. Uncertainty required attention, judgment, and the risk of being wrong. The children felt this burden acutely. They were too young to articulate it, but they felt the weight of having to reassess what they believed about the world. Some children resisted the change more strongly than others. They withdrew further, clinging to old rules because those rules had kept them alive. Others, often the youngest, adapted more easily. Having fewer memories of betrayal, they were less invested in the certainty of fear. They responded to repeated kindness with cautious openness, not because they trusted fully, but because they had not yet learned to distrust absolutely. This difference created subtle divisions. Children compared experiences quietly, watching one another for cues. They measured safety not only by the soldiers' behavior, but by how other children reacted and whether anything bad happened to those who stepped forward first. Survival had always been collective, and now interpretation was too. The bread itself became symbolic, though no one spoke of it that way. It was tangible proof that contradicted expectation. Each loaf or piece passed from hand to hand carried with it the question of whether the past rules still applied. Eating became a reflective act. The children did not consume the food thoughtlessly. They ate slowly, as if waiting for reality to correct itself. Nighttime brought the hardest moments. In the quiet, memories grew louder. The children lay awake, replaying earlier years when uniforms had meant fear fulfilled. They remembered nights when footsteps outside had led to shouting, when doors had been opened by force, when kindness had been absent or punished. These memories did not fade simply because something different was happening now. Instead, they coexisted uneasily with new experiences. The mind struggled to hold both truths at once. On one side was the accumulated weight of history, reinforced by loss and deprivation. On the other was a present that did not fully align with that history. Reconciling these was beyond the children's capacity, and even adults found it difficult. The result was emotional suspension, a state of waiting without knowing what was being waited for. Some adults warned against letting guards down. They reminded the children that war was not over, that power could change hands again, that kindness could end as abruptly as it began. These warnings were not meant to extinguish hope, but to protect against devastation. The children listened, absorbing caution as they always had, but the warnings now competed with lived experience. Gradually, the children began to test small boundaries. They stayed visible a little longer. They accepted food without immediately retreating. They watched the soldiers' faces rather than just their hands. These were not acts of trust, but of curiosity, which felt almost as dangerous. Curiosity invited disappointment. It risked emotional investment. What shocked the children was not that kindness existed, but that it persisted without explanation. If the soldiers had demanded loyalty, information, or obedience, the children could have categorized the behavior easily. But there was no clear motive presented. The absence of a visible agenda made the kindness harder to dismiss and harder to accept. This period did not resolve into comfort. Instead, it reshaped the emotional landscape. Fear was no longer absolute. It shared space with doubt, and doubt created room for something else, something tentative and fragile. The children did not yet call it hope. Hope felt too exposed, too vulnerable. But the rigid certainty that had governed their reactions began to soften at the edges. The war still defined their lives. Scarcity remained. Danger remained. Loss remained. But the children had encountered a contradiction that could not be undone. No matter how cautious they remained, they could not return fully to the belief that all uniforms meant the same thing. That belief had been damaged, not destroyed, but altered permanently. This alteration was unsettling because it removed a clear guide for behavior. The children had to begin making distinctions, however crude, between different expressions of power. This required attention and judgment they had not needed before. It was a burden, but also a sign that the world was becoming more complex than fear alone had allowed. The shock of what happened next did not come from sudden joy or dramatic reversal. It came from the slow realization that the rules they had relied on were no longer complete. The war had taught them how to hide. This moment was teaching them, reluctantly and unevenly, how to look again. Time altered the meaning of presence. What had begun as an intrusion gradually took on the weight of routine, and routine carried with it a strange, almost dangerous sense of normality. The soldiers were no longer an isolated incident to be dissected in memory, but a recurring element in the children's environment. Their arrival no longer caused immediate dispersal, though the impulse to hide still lingered beneath the surface, ready to reassert itself if needed. Fear had not disappeared, it had recalibrated. The children began to recognize patterns in the soldiers' behavior. They noticed who returned regularly and who did not. They learned which vehicles came bearing supplies rather than orders. They observed how the soldiers interacted not only with them, but with the space itself, how they navigated streets without commandeering them, how they respected homes by not entering without permission, how their authority seemed bounded rather than absolute. These observations accumulated quietly, reshaping perception through repetition rather than persuasion. This repetition mattered more than any single act of kindness. The war had taught the children that exceptions were dangerous to believe in. One good moment could be an anomaly. Two could still be coincidence. But consistency introduced a different kind of logic. It suggested intention, not performance. It implied that restraint was not accidental, but chosen. That implication was unsettling because it forced the children to confront the idea that power could be exercised without cruelty. The emotional shift was subtle and uneven. Some children adapted faster, responding to familiarity with cautious engagement. Others remained rigid, holding tightly to the belief that vigilance was the only safe posture. No one openly challenged either response. Survival had taught them not to judge coping strategies. What mattered was endurance, not interpretation. Adults watched this shift with conflicted expressions. They recognized the relief that familiarity could bring, but they also understood the cost of misplaced trust. Many had lived long enough to see alliances shift, promises dissolve, and protections evaporate. They had learned that kindness in war could be temporary, contingent, or strategic. Yet even they could not deny that something was different here. The absence of coercion persisted longer than expected. The soldiers did not attempt to reshape the children's understanding directly. They did not explain their intentions or offer assurances. They did not ask for loyalty or gratitude. This silence was both respectful and destabilizing. Without explanation, the children were left to interpret actions on their own terms. The lack of narrative forced them to confront the experience without guidance, which made it feel more real and less manipulative. Gradually, the children's bodies responded before their thoughts caught up. Muscles that had remained tense around uniforms began to loosen slightly. Breathing slowed. Eyes lifted. The act of standing upright in the presence of soldiers, rather than crouching or pressing into shadow, became possible, though not yet comfortable. These physical changes were small, but they represented a profound internal adjustment. One of the most significant changes was the return of sound. Conversations resumed at a cautious volume. Children spoke to one another while the soldiers were nearby, not loudly, but audibly. This was not defiance, it was an experiment. Each spoken word tested whether the old consequences still applied. When none followed, the children stored this information carefully, as if cataloging evidence. Play returned in fragments. A ball was kicked tentatively. A game resumed but ended quickly if attention drifted too close to the soldiers. Laughter surfaced, then stopped, then returned again. The children did not allow themselves to forget where they were, but they began to remember who they were. This reemergence of childhood felt both natural and risky, like stepping onto ice that might not hold. The soldiers' responses to these changes were restrained. They did not intervene or encourage. They did not exploit the children's growing visibility. Their restraint was critical. Had they commented, laughed, or drawn attention to the children's behavior, it might have shattered the fragile sense of safety forming. Instead, they allowed space, which communicated respect more clearly than words could have. Food continued to be shared, but it no longer carried the same shock. It became part of the rhythm rather than an interruption. This normalization was itself a revelation. Something that had once destabilized the children's understanding of the world now contributed to stability. The bread no longer symbolized contradiction, it symbolized continuity. And continuity was the foundation of trust. Still, trust remained incomplete. The children did not forget the war. They did not forget loss. At night, memories resurfaced with undiminished clarity. The faces of those taken or killed did not fade because new soldiers behaved differently. Trauma does not resolve through contrast alone. It lingers, resistant to correction. What changed was not memory, but interpretation. The children began to understand that fear could coexist with discernment, that not all threats were identical, that responding to power required attention, not reflex alone. This realization was exhausting. It demanded emotional labor that fear had previously outsourced to instinct. But it also opened a narrow path toward agency. The children were no longer reacting only to symbols, they were responding to behavior. This shift altered their relationship to the world beyond the soldiers. If uniforms could be interpreted differently, then perhaps other aspects of their environment were also more complex than they had allowed themselves to believe. This did not make the world safer, but it made it less absolute. Absolutes had been easier to manage, but they had also been suffocating. The adults noticed this change and struggled with how to guide it. They wanted to protect the children from disappointment without extinguishing the fragile openness that had begun to form. Advice became more nuanced. Instead of simple warnings, adults emphasized observation. Watch what people do. Pay attention to patterns. Do not assume, but do not forget. These lessons reflected a more complicated moral landscape, one that acknowledged both danger and possibility. As days turned into weeks, the soldiers' presence began to feel less like an event and more like a condition. This was perhaps the most unsettling development of all. The children had learned to endure crises, but stability, even tentative stability, was harder to process. It required a reorientation of expectation. It invited the dangerous question of how long this might last. That question hovered constantly, unspoken but felt. The children avoided asking it directly, as if naming it might provoke an answer they were not ready to hear. Instead, they focused on the present, on the immediate evidence that contradicted their worst assumptions. This focus was a survival strategy, refined and adapted to new circumstances. The true shock of this phase was not that the soldiers were kind, but that their kindness endured without escalation. It did not demand transformation. It did not insist on gratitude. It did not seek to overwrite memory. It simply existed, day after day, altering the emotional environment through persistence rather than persuasion. By the end of this period, the children were not free of fear, but they were no longer defined entirely by it. They had learned that authority could be constrained, that power could choose restraint, and that the world, even in war, was capable of producing moral complexity. This knowledge did not make them naive. It made them more attentive. What had begun as an encounter had become a quiet education, not one delivered through instruction, but through experience. The children were learning, slowly and without certainty, that survival did not always require disappearance. Sometimes, it required witnessing. Sometimes, it required standing still long enough to see whether the expected harm would actually arrive. This realization did not feel triumphant. It felt heavy. It added responsibility to perception. But it also restored something that fear had gradually erased, the possibility that the future might not be entirely predictable and that unpredictability, while dangerous, could also contain mercy. The deeper impact of what was unfolding did not reveal itself immediately. It emerged gradually, in the way the children began to reinterpret their own memories. Events that had once felt settled in meaning started to loosen, as if the past itself were being quietly questioned. The war had taught them a rigid moral equation. Those with power inflicted suffering, those without endured it. This equation had not been philosophical, it had been experiential. It was learned through loss, through hunger, through absence. Yet now, that equation no longer accounted for everything they were witnessing. The children did not suddenly revise their understanding of the war as a whole. They were not naive enough to mistake localized restraint for universal justice. They still saw destruction around them. They still heard stories of brutality elsewhere. Still, the existence of contradiction mattered. It suggested that cruelty was not an inevitable function of authority, but a choice that could be exercised differently. This idea unsettled them more deeply than fear ever had. Fear had been simple. It had demanded obedience and invisibility. Moral complexity demanded interpretation. It required the children to think about intention, restraint, and responsibility, concepts that had felt irrelevant in a world governed by survival. Now, those concepts forced their way back into consciousness, not as abstractions, but as lived experience. The children began to notice how the soldiers corrected one another, how certain behaviors were discouraged quietly, without display, how excess force was absent not by accident, but by design. These observations did not inspire admiration so much as confusion. Power, as the children had known it, was loud and unquestioned. Here, power seemed internally regulated. That distinction mattered. This realization extended beyond the soldiers themselves. It affected how the children viewed adults in their own community. They noticed the strain in their parents' faces ease slightly. They observed conversations that included planning rather than mere endurance. The presence of restraint from those in authority created space for imagination. People began to think not only about surviving the next day, but about what might come after. What shocked the children was not generosity, but accountability. The soldiers' behavior implied that authority could be bound by principles, even in war. This challenged the children's belief that violence was the natural endpoint of power. It suggested that power could, at times, protect rather than exploit vulnerability. This suggestion did not erase trauma. The children did not forgive the war. They did not forget what had been taken. Instead, the contradiction forced a reevaluation of blame. The war had often felt like a single, monolithic force. Now, it appeared fractured, composed of individuals capable of different choices. This fragmentation made the past harder to process. It removed the simplicity of total condemnation while offering no clear alternative. Some children resisted this reinterpretation fiercely. They clung to the old narrative because it felt safer. To admit that power could choose restraint was to acknowledge that earlier suffering might not have been inevitable. That acknowledgement carried unbearable implications. It raised questions about responsibility, about what might have been prevented, about whether cruelty had been necessary at all. Others, however, felt something closer to relief. Not relief from pain, but relief from certainty. The idea that the world was not entirely governed by cruelty allowed them to imagine futures that were not predetermined by fear. This imagination was cautious and incomplete, but it existed. And that alone marked a profound shift. The children began to understand that moral clarity in war is often retrospective, imposed after events have settled into narrative. Living through it, morality is fragmented, situational, and uneven. The soldiers' actions forced this lesson into focus. There was no grand declaration of values, no symbolic gesture intended for history. There was only consistent behavior that refused to conform to the children's worst expectations. This refusal altered how the children related to memory. Instead of organizing the past solely around harm, they began to notice moments of restraint that had once seemed insignificant. A neighbor who had shared food despite risk. An adult who had intervened quietly to prevent violence. These moments, previously overshadowed by loss, gained new weight. The children began to see that even within terror, choices had existed. This realization was painful. It complicated grief. It introduced ambiguity where certainty had once provided emotional shelter. But it also restored a sense of humanity to a world that had felt mechanized by violence. The war was no longer a faceless force. It was a collection of decisions, some cruel, some restrained, all consequential. The moral reversal did not inspire gratitude so much as responsibility. The children began to sense that how they remembered this period would matter. Memory would shape not only how they understood the war, but how they responded to authority in the future. The encounter with restraint planted a seed of discernment. It taught them to evaluate power not by appearance, but by action. This discernment extended inward. The children became aware of their own capacity for judgment. They were no longer simply reacting to danger, they were assessing behavior. This shift was subtle, but transformative. It marked the return of agency, even within constraint. Agency did not mean freedom, but it meant awareness. Adults grappled with this shift as well. Many felt gratitude mixed with unease. They recognized the value of what the soldiers represented, but they also understood the fragility of such restraint. They cautioned the children against romanticizing authority, even as they acknowledged the significance of moral choice. The message was complex. Not all power is the same, but all power demands scrutiny. The children absorbed this complexity unevenly. Some internalized it as cautious optimism, others as reinforced vigilance. Both responses were shaped by the same experience, filtered through different histories of loss and survival. What mattered was that the experience resisted simplification. It could not be reduced to propaganda or moral lesson. It remained personal, situational, and unresolved. The shock, in the end, was not the kindness itself, but what it forced the children to confront about the world and themselves. It disrupted the emotional economy of war, which had relied on predictable roles and outcomes. It introduced the possibility that even in systems built on violence, individuals could assert restraint.